September 4th, 1944. British 11th Armored Division entered the Belgian port city of Antwerp. They expected to find the harbor destroyed, the docks blown up, the cranes collapsed into the water. Every major port the Germans had abandoned in this war had been systematically demolished before retreat. Antwerp was different. The port facilities were intact. The docks were undamaged. The cranes still worked. The warehouses stood ready. It was Europe's second largest port, and after Rotterdam's destruction in 1940, the largest intact port in Western Europe, built to handle 40,000 tons of supplies per day, with direct rail connections to Germany, with enough capacity to supply the entire Allied advance into the Reich. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's forces had achieved something remarkable. They had captured the one port that could solve the Allied supply crisis, the one facility that could keep armies moving east without pause, the one asset that could end the war before Christmas. Montgomery sent a message to Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower. Antwerp captured intact, port facilities undamaged, ready for immediate use. Eisenhower was stunned by the news. For months, Allied planners had worried about logistics. The armies were advancing faster than supply lines could follow. Trucks were wearing out. Fuel was running short. Ammunition stocks were dwindling. Antwerp solved everything. Or it should have. If Montgomery did one more thing, if he cleared the approaches to the port, if he secured the 60 miles of estuary between Antwerp and the North Sea. Montgomery never gave the order. He had other priorities. More glorious priorities. Priorities that would leave Antwerp's miracle port sitting useless while Allied soldiers died for lack of supplies. The port of Antwerp sat 60 miles inland from the North Sea. Ships approaching the city had to navigate the Scheldt estuary, a winding waterway that passed through marshland, islands, and narrow channels. Every mile of that approach was controlled by German forces. On the southern bank, German 15th Army held fortified positions. On the northern approaches, German troops occupied Walcheren Island and South Beveland. They had coastal artillery covering the shipping lanes. They had mines in the water. They had clear fields of fire on any vessel attempting passage. No Allied ship could reach Antwerp's docks until those German positions were cleared. Every gun silenced, every mine swept, every fortification captured. The captured port was worthless until the estuary was secured. Montgomery's intelligence officers explained this to him on September 5th, the day after Antwerp fell. The port cannot be used, they told him. Not until the Scheldt approaches are cleared, not until German artillery is eliminated, not until the waterway is opened. Montgomery understood the problem. He acknowledged the situation. He made a decision that his staff couldn't comprehend. He decided to do something else first. Montgomery had spent the last month racing across Belgium and northern France. His 21st Army Group had advanced 250 miles in 2 weeks. He had liberated Brussels on September 3rd. He had captured Antwerp on September 4th. He was convinced the German army was finished. He believed he could end the war with one more operation. One bold thrust into Holland and across the Rhine River. One airborne assault to capture bridges and open the route into Germany's industrial heartland. Operation Market Garden. His staff raised questions. What about the Scheldt? What about securing Antwerp's approaches? What about ensuring supply lines before launching new offensives? Montgomery brushed aside their concerns. The Germans are beaten, he told them. We must maintain momentum. We must strike before they can reorganize. Market Garden takes priority. He needed Eisenhower's approval for Market Garden. It would require massive resources. 3 Allied airborne divisions, priority for fuel and ammunition, control of Allied air forces, complete commitment to his northern advance. Eisenhower was skeptical. His broad front strategy called for advancing into Germany on multiple axes. Concentrating everything on Montgomery's thrust meant starving other armies of supplies. It meant accepting risk. It meant gambling that Montgomery's assessment was correct. Montgomery made his case with absolute confidence. "Give me the resources," he argued. "I'll be in Berlin by Christmas. I'll end the war in 1944. Eisenhower approved Market Garden on September 10th. He gave Montgomery priority for supplies. He assigned 3 airborne divisions to the operation. He committed Allied air forces to the assault. Neither man gave orders to clear the Scheldt estuary. They both assumed it could wait. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. By mid-September 1944, the Allied supply situation was approaching crisis. Armies had advanced so far so fast that supply lines couldn't keep pace. The main supply port was still Normandy beaches and Cherbourg, over 400 miles behind the front lines. Every gallon of gasoline had to be trucked from Normandy to the front. Every artillery shell, every ration, every replacement part. The trucks themselves needed fuel for the round trip. The system was breaking down under its own weight. General George Patton's Third Army was running out of fuel. His tanks were sitting idle east of Paris. His advance toward the German border had stalled not because of German resistance, but because supply trucks couldn't reach him. The silence of those tanks was deafening. American crews who had spent August chasing the Germans across France at breakneck speed were now sitting on their hulls, watching the autumn rain turn the roads to sludge. They knew the Germans were reeling. They knew the road to the Rhine was open, but without fuel, a Sherman tank is just a 30-ton steel bunker. The momentum that had carried them from Normandy was evaporating, replaced by a creeping dread that they wouldn't be home for Christmas after all. General Courtney Hodges' First Army was rationing ammunition. Units were being told to limit artillery fire, to conserve machine gun rounds, to make every shot count because replacements weren't arriving. The solution sat in Antwerp, a port capable of delivering 40,000 tons daily, located 200 miles closer to the front than Normandy, with rail connections that could move supplies directly to armies. But Antwerp's docks were empty. No ships could reach them. The Scheldt estuary remained in German hands. Montgomery's 21st Army Group received priority allocation of available supplies. Everything was being diverted to support Market Garden. American armies were told to consolidate positions, to defend rather than attack, to wait while Montgomery attempted his decisive thrust. Patton protested furiously to Eisenhower. "We're being starved," he argued. "We could be advancing into Germany. Instead, we're sitting still while Montgomery gets everything for an operation that isn't even addressing our supply problem." Eisenhower held firm. "Market Garden launches September 17th, he told Patton. "When it succeeds, the supply situation will improve. When we control Holland and cross the Rhine, the strategic picture changes." September 17th, 1944. 3 Allied airborne divisions dropped into Holland. The 101st Airborne at Eindhoven, the 82nd Airborne at Nijmegen, British 1st Airborne at Arnhem, the largest airborne operation in military history. The plan was to capture bridges across rivers and canals, creating a corridor for British ground forces to advance through Holland into Germany. If it worked, Montgomery promised, the war would end in weeks. It didn't work. German resistance was stronger than intelligence had predicted. The single highway became a killing ground. British paratroopers at Arnhem were surrounded and overwhelmed. The operation collapsed in 9 days. Casualties were devastating. Over 17,000 Allied soldiers killed, wounded, or captured. The British 1st Airborne Division was effectively destroyed. German forces retained control of the Rhine River crossings. The corridor into Germany remained closed. Montgomery declared the operation 90% successful. He claimed valuable ground had been gained. He argued that lessons had been learned. He showed no inclination to accept responsibility for the disaster. By early October 1944, the Allied High Command was confronting an unpleasant reality. The German army had not collapsed. The war would not end in 1944. Winter was approaching, and Allied armies were still fighting in France and Belgium, rather than advancing deep into Germany. Eisenhower called a conference of his senior commanders. The topic was logistics, how to sustain operations through winter, how to prepare for spring offensives into Germany, how to solve the supply problem that was crippling the entire theater. The answer was obvious to everyone in the room. Antwerp. Open the port. Clear the Scheldt. Get ships bringing supplies directly to Belgium, instead of trucking everything from Normandy. Montgomery was asked why the Scheldt hadn't been cleared yet. He explained that his forces had been committed to Market Garden, that clearing the estuary would require significant resources, that German positions were strongly fortified, that the operation would take time. Eisenhower's patience was exhausted. "I gave you priority for Market Garden," he told Montgomery. "It failed. Now open Antwerp. Make it your top priority. Get the port operational before winter." Montgomery agreed. He would assign Canadian First Army to clear the Scheldt. The operation would begin immediately. The port would be opened within weeks, but October was already half over. Antwerp had been captured on September 4th. 6 weeks had passed with the port sitting useless. 6 weeks when Allied armies could have been receiving 40,000 tons daily. 6 weeks that would have consequences nobody in that conference room fully understood yet. Canadian First Army received orders to clear the Scheldt estuary in mid-October 1944. The mission was to eliminate German forces on both banks of the waterway, capture Walcheren Island, and secure the approaches to Antwerp. The Scheldt was a nightmare of low-lying polders, land reclaimed from the sea and surrounded by high dikes. The Germans had flooded large areas by destroying the dikes. Canadian troops attacked through water and mud. Infantry waded through flooded fields. Tanks couldn't maneuver off the dikes, silhouetted against the sky as perfect targets. The German 15th Army didn't just have concrete bunkers, they had the water itself. When they blew the dikes, they turned the battlefield into a freezing, briny soup. For the Canadian soldiers, this wasn't just a battle. It was a descent into hell. There were no foxholes to dig. You'd hit water in 6 inches. There was no cover. The land was as flat as a table. Men wounded in the assault didn't just fall. They slipped into the freezing mud and often drowned before medics could reach them. It was a miserable, wet, rat-infested slog where the enemy was often invisible until the water around you started boiling with machine gun fire. The fighting was savage. Canadian infantry assaulted concrete bunkers in freezing water. Engineers cleared minefields under fire. Artillery pounded German positions that had to be taken one at a time. Progress was measured in hundreds of yards per day. The operation that Montgomery promised would take weeks stretched into November. Casualties mounted. The Canadian 2nd Infantry Division lost 2,000 men taking the South Beveland Peninsula. British forces assaulting Walcheren Island suffered another 8,000 casualties. The German defenders knew exactly what they were preventing. As long as they held the Scheldt, Antwerp's port remained useless. As long as the port was useless, Allied supply lines stayed stretched. As long as supply lines stayed stretched, Allied offensives remained limited. They fought for every fortification, every village, every mile of waterway. They made the Canadians pay for every advance. They bought time for Germany to prepare its winter defenses. Finally, on November 8, 1944, Canadian forces secured Walcheren Island. The last German positions controlling the Scheldt were captured. The estuary was in Allied hands, but the waterway still had to be cleared of mines. Every channel swept, every approach verified safe. Navy minesweepers began the tedious work of making the Scheldt passable. November 28, 1944. The Liberty ship SS Fort Cataraqui entered Antwerp harbor. It was the first Allied vessel to reach the port since its capture 85 days earlier. The docks, that had sat empty for nearly 3 months, finally began receiving cargo. 85 days. From September 4th, when British forces captured the intact port, to November 28th, when the first supply ship arrived. 85 days, when those port facilities could have been delivering 40,000 tons daily to Allied armies. The arithmetic was staggering. 85 days at 40,000 tons per day equals 3.4 million tons of supplies that could have been delivered directly to Belgium instead of trucked from Normandy. Enough fuel to keep every Allied army advancing continuously. Enough ammunition to sustain major offensives. Enough of everything to maintain pressure on Germany through the fall. Instead, Allied armies had spent September, October, and most of November struggling with supply shortages that limited their operations, all while Antwerp's miracle port sat empty. Montgomery never acknowledged that prioritizing Market Garden over the Scheldt had been a mistake. He never admitted that 6 weeks had been wasted. He never accepted responsibility for the delay that crippled Allied operations through the fall. By late November, when Antwerp finally opened, the strategic situation had changed. The easy advances of late summer were over. German defenses had solidified. The weather had turned miserable. Winter warfare was beginning. And in the Ardennes forest, German forces were quietly assembling for a massive counteroffensive. Hitler had decided to exploit the Allied supply problems and overstretched front lines. He was concentrating his last reserves for one desperate gamble. The delay in opening Antwerp had given Germany exactly what it needed: time to prepare, time to reorganize, time to launch the attack that would become the Battle of the Bulge. December 16, 1944. German forces launched their Ardennes offensive through thinly defended American positions in Belgium. Over 200,000 German troops attacked along a 75-mile front. The assault achieved complete surprise. American casualties in the first 48 hours were catastrophic. Entire battalions were overrun. Communication networks collapsed. Supply dumps were captured. The German advance created a massive bulge in Allied lines. The timing was not coincidental. Hitler had chosen to attack in December for specific reasons. Allied supply lines were still strained. The port of Antwerp had only been open for 3 weeks and was still building up to full capacity. Allied armies were spread thin across a long front. German intelligence had monitored Allied supply problems throughout the fall. They knew about the fuel shortages. They knew about ammunition rationing. They knew that Allied armies had been unable to maintain sustained pressure during September, October, and November. The Ardennes offensive was Hitler's attempt to split the Allied armies, capture Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace in the West. The plan was fantastically optimistic and ultimately doomed to fail, but it succeeded in inflicting enormous casualties and extending the war. Over 80,000 Americans became casualties in the Battle of the Bulge. 19,000 were killed. The 106th Infantry Division surrendered 7,000 men in the largest mass surrender of American forces in the European theater. Fighting lasted 6 weeks in brutal winter conditions. The German offensive was eventually defeated. Allied forces eliminated the Bulge and resumed their advance into Germany. But precious time had been lost. Lives had been spent. Winter warfare had taken a terrible toll on soldiers who might have been better supplied if Antwerp had opened in September instead of late November. This was the ultimate cost of the empty port. It wasn't paid in ledgers or logistical reports. It was paid here in the freezing forests of the Ardennes by teenage American riflemen shivering in summer uniforms that should have been replaced months ago. They were fighting for their lives with rationed ammunition and dwindling medical supplies, holding the line against a German army that, by all rights, should have been crushed back in September. After Germany's surrender, Allied intelligence officers interrogated German generals about the Ardennes offensive. They wanted to understand how Germany had assembled such a powerful attack force in late 1944. They wanted to know when the decision was made. They wanted to know if earlier Allied action could have prevented it. General Alfred Jodl, Hitler's operations chief, was asked when serious planning for the Ardennes offensive began. His answer was revealing. Hitler announced the plan in mid-September 1944. Jodl submitted formal operational plans by early October. Once it became clear that Allied advances had stalled and supply problems were preventing sustained operations. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, who commanded German forces in the West, testified that the delay in opening Antwerp was noticed immediately by German intelligence. They monitored Allied supply traffic. They observed that major offensives weren't being launched. They concluded that logistics were constraining Allied operations. The German generals made clear that September and early October 1944 had been critical months. That was when Germany's western defenses were most vulnerable. That was when sustained Allied pressure could have prevented Germany from reorganizing. That was when opening Antwerp could have maintained the momentum from the summer breakout. Instead, Allied armies had paused. Market Garden had consumed resources for an operation that failed. The Scheldt remained in German hands, while Canadian forces were committed elsewhere, and Germany used the time to prepare its last desperate counterattack. The interrogations revealed something else. German commanders had been shocked when Antwerp's port wasn't immediately opened. They had assumed clearing the Scheldt would be the Allies' top priority after capturing the city. When weeks passed with no major effort to open the port, German planners realized they had been given an opportunity. Von Rundstedt was asked directly, if Antwerp had been opened in September, could the Ardennes offensive have been launched in December? His answer was unequivocal. No. If Allied supplies had been flowing freely through Antwerp in October and November, German forces would have faced sustained pressure across the entire front. There would have been no opportunity to assemble reserves for a major offensive. Eisenhower spent the rest of his life defending his decision to approve Market Garden before ensuring Antwerp was opened. He argued that Montgomery's plan had strategic merit, that the attempt to cross the Rhine in September was worth the risk, that nobody could have predicted Market Garden would fail so completely. His critics pointed out the obvious. Antwerp's importance was clear from the day it was captured. The need to clear the Scheldt was apparent to every staff officer. The supply crisis was crippling Allied operations. Opening the port should have been the absolute top priority before launching any new offensives. Eisenhower's response was political, but he was also complicit. He had to maintain the Anglo-American alliance. Montgomery was Britain's most prominent general. Denying him resources for Market Garden would have created diplomatic problems. Churchill was already sensitive about British forces playing a secondary role to American armies. The decision came down to coalition politics versus military efficiency. Eisenhower chose to keep Montgomery happy, to give him his chance at glory, to prioritize alliance harmony over operational logic. The cost of that choice was measured in supply tonnage that didn't get delivered in September, October, and early November, in offensives that couldn't be launched due to fuel shortages, in German forces that escaped destruction because Allied pressure couldn't be sustained, in the 85 days that Antwerp sat useless. Eisenhower was a master of coalition warfare. He held together armies from multiple nations with different strategic cultures. He managed egos and political pressures that would have overwhelmed most commanders. His diplomatic skills were essential to Allied victory. But diplomacy has costs. Sometimes the costs are paid by soldiers who needed supplies that didn't arrive because a port sat empty for 3 months. Montgomery never admitted that leaving Antwerp useless while pursuing Market Garden was a strategic error. In his memoirs, he defended every decision. He argued that Market Garden had been 90% successful. He claimed that German opposition had been unexpectedly strong. He suggested that if Eisenhower had given him more resources, the operation would have achieved its objectives. The 3-month delay in opening Antwerp received barely a paragraph in his account of the campaign. British historians have been more critical. Even those sympathetic to Montgomery acknowledge that clearing the Scheldt should have taken priority over Market Garden, that the port's importance was obvious, that the consequences of the delay were severe. Max Hastings, who wrote extensively about the Northwest Europe campaign, called Montgomery's decision to prioritize Market Garden over Antwerp one of the major strategic blunders of the war. The captured port represented an opportunity to maintain momentum from the summer breakout. Montgomery squandered that opportunity for an operation that achieved nothing. Antony Beevor noted that Montgomery's ego and ambition led him to pursue spectacular operations rather than unglamorous logistics. Clearing the Scheldt estuary wasn't glamorous. It was brutal infantry fighting in miserable terrain. It wouldn't make headlines. It wouldn't position Montgomery as the man who ended the war with a brilliant maneuver. Montgomery's reputation survived the war intact. He was promoted to Field Marshal. He received honors and accolades. The British public revered him. His mistakes were overlooked or minimized in official histories. The Canadian soldiers who fought for 6 weeks in the flooded Scheldt received less recognition. The American soldiers who died in the Bulge never knew that their supply problems had been prolonged by strategic choices made in September. The 85 days that Antwerp sat useless became a footnote in histories that celebrated Montgomery's brilliance. The cost of Montgomery's decision wasn't just measured in tonnage. Those 85 days meant fuel for Patton's Third Army to maintain its advance through September, ammunition for First Army to conduct major offensives in October, replacement parts for vehicles that wore out from excessive use, winter clothing that arrived late because of transportation constraints. These shortages show what Allied armies lost, but the human cost is harder to calculate. How many Americans died in the Bulge because Germany had time to prepare its offensive? How many British and Canadian soldiers were killed clearing the Scheldt in November when the operation could have been conducted in September with less resistance? How many months was the war extended because Allied momentum was lost in the fall? The facts are clear. Montgomery captured an intact port on September 4th. He didn't clear the approaches until November. Allied armies struggled with supply shortages for 3 months. Germany used that time to reorganize and counterattack. Montgomery chose glory over logistics. Soldiers paid for that choice with their lives, with their blood, with months of suffering that might have been avoided if the miracle port at Antwerp had been opened when it was captured, rather than when it was finally cleared 85 days later. Wars are won by logistics as much as by battles. The most brilliant tactics fail if supplies don't reach the front. Montgomery's choice to prioritize Market Garden over clearing the Scheldt estuary revealed his fundamental misunderstanding of what mattered most in September 1944. He believed one more spectacular operation could end the war. He was wrong. The unglamorous work of clearing mines, capturing fortifications, and opening supply lines didn't appeal to him. It wasn't the kind of operation that would make him the man who won the war, so he pursued glory instead. And the war continued.